cases of a country being part of the European Union and not a member of the OECD countries, does this affect any treaties being entered into? So, yes, a country's membership in the European Union or the EU, but not in the OECD, can affect the treaties if it enters into, particularly in areas such as tax, trade, investment, and regulatory environment. So it's quite important to understand this. So if we go into a little bit more detail, if you look at double taxation agreements and the impact of how this works, so EU directives take precedence over bilateral tax treaties. Important to remember this. So in other words, there could be a jurisdiction that forms part of the EU, which has a treaty with another, let's say, non-EU country or just another jurisdiction. And what will happen is if there's a certain EU directive on tax, then all member states they have to comply with the EU tax directive if they are a true member state of the EU. So it's quite important to understand that. So in other words, in general, you would usually say domestic law takes precedence over most law until you get to a treaty. When you have a DTA, then the DTA takes precedence over the domestic law or national tax treaties and national tax law. And then you have the EU tax directives, which have to be complied with if you are a EU member. Quite important to understand that. And there's various key directives that exist, parent subsidiary directives, or PSD as they are known. You have the interest and royalties directive and the anti-tax avoidance directive. So even if the country is not in the OECD, these EU laws must be followed. So quite important to understand that. So the country could not be part of the OECD, but does form part of the EU, and then they have to follow this. So access to the OECD model versus the UN model tax treaties. So one needs to understand, if you go and look at one of the other, let's say, sub-themes of tax, which is transfer pricing, you have the UN model also for transfer pricing, and then you also have the OECD guidelines. And in many times they say more or less the same, but there are nuances and certain differences. So the OECD Model Tax Convention is widely used for tax treaty negotiations, but non-OECD EU countries may rely more on the UN model for developing country treaties between them and those, let's say, developing countries. So they have less influence in the OECD-led global initiatives initiatives. For example, the BEPS initiatives. Examples of these are Bulgaria, Romania, and Croatia, which are in the EU, but they are not OECD members. Their DTAs often reflects a mix of the OECD and the UN model provisions for the reasons just mentioned. So there are also situations where there's a limited role in OECD's multilateral tax instruments, and that's where they modify existing tax treaties to align with BEPS recommendations. So that's another situation. So if we go and look then at trade agreements and the EU competence, the EU exclusive competence in trade is where there's a trade policy has an exclusive EU competence under the common commercial policy. So the European Commission negotiates all trade agreements, example, the free trade agreements, on behalf of its member states. And the implications thereof are a non-OECD EU country cannot enter into independent trade agreements. So you also have what is referred to as the World Trade Organization membership. And even if you're not an OECD member, an EU country is bound by the WTO rules, the World Trade Organization rules, as part of the EU's trade commitments. So what I'm also, as you can see, there's quite a bit of law and legal understanding required here. So in these situations, when there's a little bit of doubt, always try and bring in some legal consultation or advice from counsel to understand how this works. Okay, so regulatory and competition law influence. So the EU state aid rules. prevent countries from giving selective tax benefits that distort competition. So an example is the EU overruled tax rulings granted to Apple and Fiat, despite the national tax treaty provisions, and that you'll also find in the media. So non-OECD EU countries must comply with EU competition law, even if their national policies differ. So one can appreciate the differences here and the nuances here when you sit with a situation like that. So the alignment with the EU financial regulations means that a membership of the EU means that the EU banking, the finance, and digital economy regulations need to be complied with, even if you are not a OECD participant. Example thereof is the EU's Pillar 2 global minimum tax implementation. The 15% rule affects all EU states, even the non-OECD members. So one needs to understand and appreciate this. The last point before I summarize is the political and diplomatic impact on treaty negotiations. Now, as one can appreciate, there are certain jurisdictions across the world which have a larger say in treaties and trade, as they form a larger part of the world economy. So it would be fair to assume and to say that there will be political influences on treaty negotiations. So non-OECD EU countries do not participate in the OECD negotiations, which limits their direct influence over global tax standards. However, they do benefit from the EU lobbying, which then assists them. So, but you could be in a situation where you would prefer to not be in that position, and then you have to follow through as the EU directives, as we see, do overrule, even though you are a non-OECD member. So interaction with developing countries, the EU promotes tax transparency initiatives, which are like the exchange of information, country-by-country reporting, and the non-OECD EU members must align with EU tax policies, which may affect the treaties with developing countries. And that's why one must, as I said, try and involve legal counsel as far as possible, or where it is possible. So in summary, EU membership dominates treaty negotiations, even for the non-OECD EU countries. Tax treaties must align with EU directives. Trade treaties are controlled by the EU. And OECD tax standards apply indirectly. But non-OECD EU members have no direct say in their development. And then lastly, the regulatory compliance, for example, the state aid tax rulings, is enforced by the EU, sometimes invalidating national tax treaties. And one needs to actually appreciate that this can become very technical, and it's not applicable necessarily to every situation that one will find yourself in international tax.